Hello everyone, I'm Patrick Arlt, and this is Building Apps with Esri Leaflet. And I want to start off first by discussing what Leaflet is. Leaflet is a mapping API that over the last several years has been able to maintain its popularity, especially since it is particularly a really small, focused mapping API. And it's got a really small list of features, including raster tiles, grids, basic support for rendering points, lines, and polygons, as well as things like pop-ups. And by keeping it Web Mercator only, it's managed to maintain kind of a good hold on open source mapping APIs, particularly since it has such a rich plugin ecosystem. It's designed to be very small at its core, but also be very extended. And you can see there's a huge variety in even just the plugins that are available for it. So that brings us to Esri Leaflet. And Esri Leaflet is a plugin for Leaflet that simplifies integrating ArcGIS services into Leaflet. And it is powered mostly by our community. It's the most favorited project on Esri's GitHub. It has the highest number of contributors, despite ArcGIS or SJS coming up fast. And it's maintained by myself, Gavin, and Jacob, who are all Esri employees. And even though we maintain it, there's no set roadmap or product lifecycle or release schedule or support lifecycle. None of the things that you would expect from something like the JavaScript API, because it's mostly just powered by you and powered by a small group of developers inside Esri. There are still a couple reasons to use it, and those are, it does still maintain a really small footprint. If you're really counting kilobytes and you don't need a ton of functionality, Esri Leaflet might be the right choice. It maintains a really simple API that relates to kind of its small footprint. It doesn't try to do everything like the JavaScript API does. It just tries to get basic support for everything. If you already have an app built in Leaflet, or there's already particular Leaflet plugins that you want to use, that's a good reason to use Esri Leaflet. It's also open source and it's very stable. There haven't been a lot of changes to it and there aren't a lot of bugs. So it is a very stable, kind of slow-moving project at this point, which is actually kind of starting to be to its benefit. Comparing that, though, with the JavaScript API, you might want to use the JavaScript API since it does have a lot more capabilities. That's where all of the big, fancy things are being built. It's also you're gonna get a lot better performance in visualization with the JavaScript API. The JavaScript API renders everything in WebGL, which renders on the graphics card. And that gives it huge performance benefits, even for hundreds of thousands of features. The JavaScript API also has its rich widget library and does 3D and has really tight integration with all of the things you would know from ArcGIS, like renderers, web maps, support for ArcGIS identity, built-in support for editing. So those are kind of things that you'll want to kind of compare and contrast if you're deciding what to use. So I want to go directly into some demos and kind of show what you can do with Esri Leaflet and show how it could be manipulated or extended in terms of trying to figure out what you can do, why might you want to use it. So the first demo I want to show is just basic Leaflet. What are some of the basic features of Leaflet? And this is actually straight out of Leaflet's introductory demo. So we have a polygon, a point, and a circle. And these things, when I click on them, they each have a pop-up on them. And when I click on the map, it shows me the coordinates where I clicked. And this is just a really, really basic Leaflet application. So let's take a look. You can grab it off of CDN. So we're going to include the Leaflet CSS and the Leaflet JavaScript, and then we'll include Esri Leaflet. And then we can actually kind of skip down a little bit. Sorry, that's the Leaflet CSS and JavaScript. We'll skip down. You can see kind of our default 100% wide and high map. We have a div with an ID of map, and then the Leaflet API actually just looks like we need an l.map at a certain ID, and then we set the view on it. So this is lat long, and zoom level 13. And then we want to add a tile layer. This is raster tiles, so these are PNGs from OpenStreetMap that we're looking at. But then you can also see there's API for adding those three things. The marker, the circle, and the polygon are really simple. The polygon is just an array of points. We add it to our map. We bind a pop-up to it. We can put the pop-up content in there as HTML. And then we can define something like an on-click function. We just have a pop-up that we create. We'll set the lat long of the pop-up to where we clicked. We'll set the content of the pop-up, and then we'll open the pop-up on the map, and we'll just do that whenever the map is clicked on. So a really basic API for just rendering a map, getting it on a page, adding some stuff to it, and moving on. So now let's take a look at kind of the basic feature set of Esri Leaflet. So we're going to put a tile layer on the map, we're going to put a feature layer on the map, and we're going to add some search capability. So this is a feature layer I've created with some of the oldest LA restaurants. I pulled this list off an old news article a long time ago. So each of the restaurants kind of has a custom point icon, and we can search for somewhere like, let's say we are at LA City Hall. And we can take a look at some of the restaurants that are around LA City Hall. So this is also using the topographic raster base map, so you can see it's using the default raster tiles. So let's take a look at how this was created. So we have kind of the same thing. We have Leaflet from a CDN, Esri Leaflet from a CDN, and then we have the geocoder package from a CDN as well. And we have the map and the body and just your basic configuration. So we're going to create a map. We're going to set the lat long. We're going to set the zoom level. We're going to add the topographic base map to it with the Esri base map layer. We're going to create a icon, and the icon is actually going to be our restaurant PNG, and we'll define how big it is and where we should anchor it relative to the geographic information, and where the pop-up should be anchored relative to the icon. And then we're going to define a feature layer. So we're going to go Esri feature layer. We'll pass it a URL to our feature layers, ends in /0. And then we're going to call this function called point to layer. And what this does is it takes the point from the feature service and actually converts it into a layer that is added to the map. In Leaflet, pretty much anything you put on the map is a layer. So this marker that we're returning is our icon, and we're going to return that as the layer that we want to use to represent this particular feature. And then we can actually bind a pop-up, and we can use the Leaflet template utility to just format some HTML based on this feature's properties. So that's how you get that really basic, I just need a map with a feature layer and get a pop-up. And as a bonus, we can also configure search inside of our layer. So if I zoom out a little bit, I can probably search for the Smokehouse restaurant, and I can zoom particularly just to that result in my feature layer. So you can find any kind of place either in your feature layer or in your geocoding service. So to set that up, we create a new geocoding provider for ArcGIS Online. We create a new feature layer provider to get results from our feature service. In this case, we want to search the name and description fields. This is the label for the widget. We're going to buffer them by 500 meters when you zoom to them, and then this is how we'll actually format the suggestion. We'll format with the name property. And then we'll create a new geocoding search. We'll pass it our providers, and then we'll add it to the map. And this is actually how the UI control is added to the map. You add them to the map just like layers, and they'll automatically be added to the map in the correct place. And there's a lot of different options for sorting them and putting them in different corners and things like that. But this is kind of the most basic example. You can also consume map services with Esri Leaflet. So Esri Leaflet has a dynamic map layer, and that's actually the same as the JavaScript API's map image layer, where it'll actually pull a raster image off of a server for really large, complex data. So this is a soil layer, and you can actually bind pop-ups to these too. It'll actually do the server request and everything as well. So this looks pretty similar to our previous example. We have a map service, so this is kind of the same thing. Going to get it from CDN. We're going to set up a map div, and we're going to set up the gray base map, and we're going to set up a dynamic map layer. We'll give the URL to our map server, and we'll reduce the opacity just a little bit. And this actually just adds it directly to our map. And because we're using the gray and gray labels, our labels actually appear on top of the soil layer. And we can see what it looks like. We add a slightly lower opacity, and it just makes that a little bit more subtle. Now, one of the other things you can do with both Leaflet and Esri Leaflet is really take advantage of some of the great plugins. And one of the ones that I think really put Esri Leaflet on the map is actually the clustering plugin. And the clustering plugin is a special Esri Leaflet plugin. So I have that same restaurants layer that I had before. I'm just zoomed way out, and that shows the clusters instead for each clump of restaurants. So as I zoom into downtown LA, I can see these. And the clusters have a really nice animation to them. So as you zoom in and out, they tend to combine nicely and kind of get sucked into their nearest cluster. So you can see there's a lot of variety in how you can customize and configure this. And all the behavior is actually driven by a Leaflet plugin. I didn't write the clustering engine. I didn't write how the clusters get displayed. I just wrote the piece that integrates the data from a feature service into the clustering engine that was already a Leaflet plugin. So that looks like this. So we're going to grab Leaflet, we're going to grab Esri Leaflet, and then we're going to get the marker cluster plugin, which is the Leaflet marker clusters, and then we're going to get the Esri Leaflet clustering plugin. And some of those have some CSS files that we'll need just to make sure everything displays well. And then we're going to create a bunch of styles for our clusters. So these clusters are fairly complex. They also get like a digit class, so you can actually have different sizes for things like 1, 2, or 3, 4-digit clusters. So we're going to start off the same way. We're going to add the topographic base map. We're going to create a Esri cluster feature layer, and we're going to pass it some options. And some of these are options from the clustering service, and some of them are things that we added. So this is the URL to our feature layer. You can see it ends in /0. We have the spiderify on max zoom, show coverage on hover, remove outside visible bounds. Those are all things that get passed into the clustering. We're going to force disabling the cluster entirely at zoom level 16. And then in order to create those custom icons, we do this icon create function, and that receives a cluster which has information about the cluster that's being created. So we're going to get the number of items in the cluster. We're going to figure out how many digits that is. And then we're going to return a l.div icon. And that just creates an empty div as a leaflet icon. And we're going to put the HTML as the number. And we're going to give it that cluster class. And we're going to give it the proper digit class. And we're going to say that this doesn't have any size, because we're going to size it with CSS. So a 2-digit cluster is going to be 34 by 34. And have a font size of 16, for example. And then we're going to add this to the map, and then we're going to bind the same pop-up template to it so that when you click on an individual restaurant, it still shows the pop-up, but when you click on a cluster, it'll fall back to the default behavior of the clustering library. So this is one of the neat ways that we've done integrations with more plugins, and this one still is one of the most popular ones that we've created for it. It is possible to do editing in Esri Leaflet. The process is a lot more manual in terms of writing it, as opposed to using some of the integrated editing widgets in the JavaScript API. But you can create custom kind of editing experiences. So here I have a feature service with some polygons, and if I double click on this polygon, I can actually enable the leaflet editing library, and I can customize the shape of this. So maybe I'll move it over here, and then you can actually pass that back to the API. So if I refresh this page, that'll maintain that shape that I just edited. So it is possible to do some editing. Let's add a few more shapes here, and then we can add a new weird shape, and we'll double click, then we can edit that. And when we refresh the page, those should all be there. So it is possible. This is driven by another Leaflet plugin called, I think, Leaflet Editing. So in this case, we're going to grab Leaflet, Esri Leaflet, set up our map. We're going to grab the Leaflet Path Drag and Leaflet Editable plugins, and then we're going to set up our map, and we're going to say double click zoom is false, and we're going to add the editable true flag, which is from one of the plugins. Double click zoom just disables double clicking to zoom in, so that when we double click on one of our features, we don't accidentally zoom the map in. And then we have this Wildfire Districts feature service. This has public editing enabled, so we're going to edit the polygons for that. We're going to create a new leaflet edit control, and we're going to put that in the top left. We're going to create some custom buttons that'll activate the editing. And we're going to create a polygon editor and a rectangle editor. And then we're going to add those two new controls to our map. And when you click on one of the features, we're going to actually delete it. So apparently, if you Command or Control click, it'll remove it from the map. Otherwise, it'll turn editing on for that feature. When you double click, it will toggle editing off. And if the edit is no longer enabled, we'll actually call the update features method on the Wildfire Districts feature layer, and we'll turn our layer into GeoJSON. And the API will actually automatically convert the GeoJSON into the ArcGIS geometry format and upload it to the feature service. So the editing is pretty fine-grained, and you can build a lot of stuff into it. And you have a pretty rich set of interactions and editing plugins and editing tools that you can use. And the Esri Leaflet API actually has lots of features like add, update, delete features that you can use to interact with the editing tools and the map to actually persist the data in the feature service. It's also pretty easy because of all of these integrations and because of the open nature of Leaflet and Esri Leaflet that you can actually mix with lots of other APIs. So in this case, we can look at the Cedar charting library. This is a feature layer of trees in Portland, and you can see as I zoom in on the layer, this chart updates dynamically, and it just highlights only the features that are available on the map. So if I zoom out, then I hover over these, it actually also updates the opacity to show me the tree height relative to the tree diameter, and I can highlight those specific trees. So for example, this outlier in the mountains is extremely high. This tree over here is extremely wide, and I can find that information on the graph. So looking at the sample code for that, we're going to load the libraries, we're going to set up a map, we're going to grab chart.js. So we're going to set up our basic map, we're going to create our feature layer, and then we're going to start to define our chart. So we have two axes, we have height and diameter. And these have a max and a step size. You could calculate this from the API if you wanted to. In this case, we know what our bounds are. And we're going to create a new scatter chart. And then whenever we move or zoom in the map, we're going to call this update chart. And whenever we load new features from the trees feature layer, we're also going to update the chart. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to loop over each active feature whenever we update the chart. And this is just a utility function that basically says for every feature that's shown on the map, do something. And what we're going to do is we're going to build an array of data to pass into our scatter plot and then update it. And as kind of an additional step, we're going to, when we hover, we're going to run over each feature and we're going to set the opacity and the z-index depending on where you are hovering in the chart. And this is just kind of a nice, fun, simple interaction that I think is really interesting. And it's kind of opened up by having these basic utility functions. So one of the final demos that I want to show is integrating with a leaflet library called Open Source Route Machine. And this actually integrates the routing service in ArcGIS Online with the open source routing machine plugin for Leaflet, which is actually this control. So you can actually do directions. So let's look at LA City Hall. It's the wrong City Hall. So you can actually draw on the map, and this is using the routing service under the hood that's as a part of ArcGIS Online, and then it's actually mapped in Leaflet. And the directions work pretty well. And this also has lots of other fun interactions, like you can add waypoints, you can drag the route around, things like that. So I can actually take this and kind of drag a new waypoint over to there, and it will reroute me. It also has features like reordering, so I can actually take this and reorder them front to back, back to front. I can take this, I can drag it over here, and it'll reroute. So all sorts of interesting features, and this is just powered by essentially the back end. So this is the integration of the routing engine. You can find this on GitHub in our documentation, and it just has to be copied into your project. So in order to use it, though, we're going to do kind of the same setup, and we're going to also include the leaflet control geocoder and leaflet routing machine, and we're going to set up a street space map. We're going to create a routing control. We'll put in those initial waypoints that you saw, and then we're going to pass this to the router, and we're going to use the open source Nomentum geocoder. You could also write a custom geocoder that used the ArcGIS Online geocoder. We're going to allow route while dragging, and then we're going to allow reversing the waypoints. We'll just add that to the map. And that kind of lights up this nice little directions experience that you can use inside of a leaflet application. So it is fairly straightforward to integrate with lots of these other plugins and things that you might normally not need to do in a leaflet application. It is possible to kind of mirror some JavaScript API functionality. And then as a final feature to kind of show off in the API, I want to show labeling. And there's a lot of labeling engines that can be a part of Esri Leaflet using some of the same functions that we used for the charting, actually. So in this demo, we have a feature layer that has states and the population of each state. And you can see that the labels are getting kind of added to each state dynamically. And if I zoom out, it'll actually drop labels off based on population. So New York has a higher population than some of these states. So you can see California has knocked off Nevada. So it'll actually show and hide labels based on weighted properties. And this works through a plugin called Label Gun, which also relies on a spatial index called rbush. And the integration here is also fairly straightforward. So we have our map and our base map, and then we're going to create a labeling engine which defines how to show and hide our labels. And we're going to create a feature layer, and we're going to pass that on each feature. So for every feature, we want to bind a tooltip to that layer, which has the name of the state. And then we can actually show and hide that label. So whenever our feature layer loads, we're going to destroy any existing labels. We're going to loop through each of the features. We're going to calculate the label weight from this population 2007 field. and then we're going to add that layer to label gun with this add layer. So that takes a layer, an ID, and a weight. And we're going to get the tooltip for that layer. If there is one, we're going to get the bounding rectangle. We'll calculate a bounding box out of it. And then we're going to add that bounding box to our label engine. And this is just a simple switch case for determining the label weight. And so what's going to happen is once we ingest that label into label gun, it's going to get picked up and it's going to adjust the bounding box based on the bounding box of the layer, and then it's going to show and hide our tooltip, which is our label. So you can actually custom style these things and do other interesting pieces, but that's another integration using some of the basic functionality. So there's a lot to think about, right? All of the demos that I just showed, the JavaScript API really has that kind of built in. There's already a geocoding widget. There's already support for labeling using a lot of the default renderers. There's already some built-in support for clustering. There's definitely tons of built-in support for editing and charting. So what you need to do is you need to think about what's right for your project. If your project has a relatively constrained scope, like you just want to create a simple map for kind of a one-off use case, Esri Leaflet might be a really good choice. You know that the project is relatively simple, it has a defined scope, it's not going to grow in its capabilities a whole lot. But if a project is likely to grow in complexity or grow in scope of what it needs to do pretty significantly, it might be better to start with the JavaScript API, for example. So we do have a lot of documentation, a lot of examples. We do encourage use of GitHub issues if you run into problems or potential bugs or potential errors. We definitely try to keep on top of the GitHub issues. But start with the doc and the examples. You can find the demos for this presentation just with view source, or there's also a GitHub repo for this that you can search on my GitHub profile. So we are going to talk, I do want to talk a little bit about in 2020. Where is Esri Leaflet going, right? It's been largely just kind of almost on hold, and there hasn't been a ton of new features added. So one of the things that we are going to do is we are going to add vector tile support to Esri Leaflet this year. And this is already far enough along I can show a demo of it. This uses Mapbox GLJS under the hood, so it does add a lot of weight to the project. Rendering vector tiles is not easy and takes a lot of code. So that's something that we'll definitely show. And we'll definitely see it come later this year. So this is a simple code pen demo using Leaflet and Mapbox GLJS with one of the Esri vector base maps. So you can see this is the default tile layer. This is the Esri, the ArcGIS open source, open street map layer. And you can see this is actually rendering fully inside Leaflet. The features are nicely synced to the viewport, all of the other features that you would kind of expect. So this is going to form the basis of a new vector tile base map plugin for Esri Leaflet. Some of the other things we're doing is we're doing improved caching for feature layers. This has been something that's come up recently, actually, with coronavirus, where the coronavirus feature layer is insanely popular. And what we want to do is for those really popular layers, we really want to improve the tile generation and the caching. So you'll start seeing faster response times and hopefully less rate limiting when using Esri Leaflet. And we are definitely committed to doing just kind of continual fixes and updates, fixing any bugs that might be encountered in the existing code and things like that. And then we're also going to be doing some documentation updates. So we're hoping to separate out kind of the official plugins like the clusters. There's also a heat map layer, and there are a few other kind of official plugins that we really maintain and pay attention to. And then that'll be separated from things like the charting libraries or editing or the open source route machine and the kind of the other experimental plugins that other people have made. So we're hoping to separate those and kind of define them separately. And this is largely the plan for Esri Leaflet in 2020. Thank you for watching. You can find the slides at this link. You can also find the demo source code either with just view source or finding it on GitHub if you search for Patrick Arlt. Thank you.